Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Introducing RADequal, a discussion on increasing diversity in radiology and informatics. I hope a lot of you are familiar with our old name, RADXX, and we'll get to explaining in just a moment some of the reason for that name change. I'll be moderating today's discussion. My name is Catherine Slotnick. I'm the Director of Marketing at Ombra Health, an IntelliBrand company, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Geraldine McGinty and Dr. Elizabeth Hawk. So I'll give them both a quick moment to introduce themselves before we get started today. Dr. McGinty, would you like to share a little bit more about yourself with the audience?
I would be delighted to. Thank you so much, Catherine. So I am a radiologist, a breast imager by training, and I have recently actually transitioned into more of a medical school administration role at Weill Cornell. But obviously, radiology is always going to be at the heart of my practice as a physician. I had a long career in leadership at the American College of Radiology, and I'm really passionate about making radiology and making our radiology workforce more reflective of the patients we serve.
Thank you. And Dr. Hawk, would you like a quick introduction as well?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. It's an absolute pleasure to be joining you all today, and certainly a true honor for me to be sharing this platform with Geraldine. I am a nuclear medicine and neuroradiologist. Really split my time between the private practice world with radiology partners, Matrix Radiology, and the academic world as an assistant professor for Stanford. Really passionate about imaging informatics and artificial intelligence for radiology partners. I'm their National Director of Innovation Engagement, which means I get to help shepherd the cultural adaptation of AI across our national practice. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I'm in the beginning of my hopefully long career with the American College of Radiology, now on my 6th year with the CSC. And really just delighted to be here. This is probably my favorite thing to talk about, and I'm so excited to share my thoughts and have a really dynamic discussion this morning.
Thank you. We are very excited for today's discussion. So a little bit about RADequal. So for those of you familiar with us before, our name was RADXX, and the goal has been to foster networking and mentorship opportunities for women leaders in radiology, informatics, and IT management of radiology systems. And I think what we have done really well and very much focused on as our specialty is really that advocacy and mentoring, which we'll talk about a bit more later. But we have a speakers bureau. We have several programs on our website as well, where we try to connect individuals to mentor one another. So we have really tried to offer people that person who can lead them to the next step in their career. Unfortunately, we know that women are still an underrepresented group in radiology and informatics, and even across IT as a whole, quite frankly. And we hope that by showing individuals, other women, other people who look like them in positions of leadership, they can be guided to the next step in their career. Over time, through our conversations with members, we began to realize that our name was a little bit inconsistent with our values. We felt that those 2 female chromosomes really kind of represented women in a very binary way, and we wanted to make sure that no one in the community felt excluded. So that is the reason for our name change. We have just started the rebranding process, so you may have noticed the new RADequal logo appearing across social and on marketing materials. And we also just relaunched and reopened our annual awards program. Those awards applications are open for about the next 2 months, so please check those out on our website. Recommend anyone who you think might be a good fit, and we will be keeping everyone posted with more news about that award ceremony. This is a picture from a past in-person award ceremony, and we do really hope that we can get back to some of those events as soon as possible. Dr. McGinty or Dr. Hawk, anything else you want to add here about the name change? Perhaps any feedback that you've heard from the community?
I would just say that I would really give credit to some of those members of our community who were invaluable to me. Dr. Evelyn Carroll has been a great advisor on this. And, I had always said at the beginning that I suppose a long-term goal was that we wouldn't need this kind of effort. Right. But what we certainly wanted to do was make sure that, we were evolving to meet, I think, our changing view of what it means to be inclusive.
I believe this is a beautiful example of new power and embracing all of the diversity of voices that have come to the table to want to contribute to shaping the direction of this movement and owning it for the next generations to come. And incredible credit to the organization sponsoring and leading this for listening to the new voices at the table and for being willing to evolve and to grow in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes, we were very excited. Our senior brand manager at Ombra, Becky Kincaid, I have to give her a quick shout out for the redoing of the logo and a lot of the creative energy that she put into this. So it was a very, very exciting process. So this brings us really to the first section of panel questions, which is increasing diversity in radiology and informatics. So we'll start kind of right at the beginning of someone's career. How can radiology programs draw in more women? I'm kind of curious to see if you think there's a specific reason why there are typically less women than men interested in the field. I don't know if that's because there are specific issues that women feel that they face, or perhaps, it's kind of a cycle where since there are less women, women don't see other women in the field and that turns them off. So we can go ahead and start here with you, Dr. Hawk. What do you think radiology resident programs can do to increase more women? And why do you think this is a problem in the first place?
So this is the $1 million question that everyone likes to ask. And certainly I think I get asked this maybe once a month. Why aren't there more women in radiology? What can we do? And I think that the number one thing that bothers me about this conversation is so often we blame misunderstanding of radiology. We actually blame the woman or the underrepresented minority. We say, oh, they don't realize that it's patient-centered, or that there's enough communication, or, oh, they think that there's too much radiation, or there's a million different reasons for misunderstanding that someone can give for the woman or the underrepresented minority, depending on the conversation. And I think that women and underrepresented minorities actually have done their homework and know what radiology is and know that it's phenomenal and know that it's patient-centered and full of really rich interactions. I think that the real difficult conversation to have, that's much more difficult than citing misunderstanding, is that there is still a cultural issue that we're addressing. There's still unconscious bias, there's still microaggression, and there's still sort of a cultural reset that we're all working very hard on to make these programs really wonderful environments for people of all different backgrounds, abilities, cultures to be able to work and thrive in. And I think that the way we need to approach this is very purposefully and very strategically. I don't think it's enough to sort of say, oh, we need to make it more friendly. I think we need to have unconscious bias training. And I think we need to have, formal diversity programs that really address these issues head on, rather than just citing misunderstanding of the field. Those are my 2 cents on it.
I think that that's very interesting. I actually hadn't heard that point that you said regarding that some of the blame is placed on the individual and their lack of understanding of it. I think that's quite frustrating to hear, quite frankly. What about you, Dr. McGinty? How do you think radiology resident programs can draw in more women?
Well, I certainly would agree with Elizabeth. We used to hear things like, oh, women don't want to be exposed to radiation, or they're afraid of physics. And I'll give huge credit to the ACR's Commission on Women and Diversity and a really rigorous survey that was led by Dr. Paripandra Pandey that looked at what are the real barriers? And I think Elizabeth called it, we have to make these, we have to make it appealing, make it feel as if it's a place you can succeed. I think there are a number of things that we need to do around, perhaps mandatory radiology clerkships so that people get exposed to radiology. But, specifically some of the discussions we've had around family leave during residency, for example, making sure that that's not ambiguous, that, it's absolutely clear that you can have a family, you can be a radiologist, and you can succeed. There are many things like that we can do. And then I think the other thing is, the famous quote from Eleanor Holmes Norton, you can't be what you can't see. And having more women in leadership roles is critically important. And of course, underrepresented minorities in medicine, the same thing.
This brings us to our next question, which kind of stems right off of that. So I'll let you continue, Dr. McGinty. This is a great question that I think is quite patient-centric in its tone. And it's regarding the importance of having diverse voices at the table. And I'm curious if you've ever been in a situation where you felt that more diverse perspectives were needed. I know for myself, after having been involved in RADequal-Increasing, now I am very conscious of, as we jokingly call them, the manels, the all-male panels, and making sure from a marketing perspective that we are including diverse voices, even when we create content or panels. And certainly I've heard that across medicine, particularly in clinical trials, it's really critical to have diversity. Sometimes there's a whole subset of people that the treatment could be less than ideal for because they were not well represented. So I'd love to hear more about, what you think regarding diversity and how it actually improves outcomes for everyone involved.
Well, look, there's reams of business literature that suggests that diverse teams outperform. But maybe I'll just share one specific example from my history in leadership at the college. And when we started the Patient and Family Centered Care Commission in 2015, we were trying to think, how do we really bring patient voices into our decision making at the ACR? And huge credit to Jim Rawson, who was the founding chair of that commission, saying, well, we need to have patients on our committees. And that was not uncontroversial. How on earth are we going to bring these patient voices in? That they wouldn't necessarily understand what we were talking about. And I think we've taken a very thoughtful approach to doing just that. And it has critically moved us forward in how we think about, how we publish our appropriate use criteria and make sure that the language is patient friendly, how we've really thought about our data science institute. We would not have had the rich discussions and I think the patient-centered decisions without having the voices of our patients at the table. So I think you can extrapolate that to so many other axes of diversity.
I think that's an interesting point. We've had a couple cases in my time at Ombre where we've created content that's designed to be patient friendly in terms of a patient portal. And I will make the effort to ask someone not involved in the industry to look at it. And they tell me, I have no idea what these instructions mean. I don't know any of these words. So I think it is very critical to always involve that outside party. What about you, Dr. Hawk? Any experiences with the importance of diverse voices at the table?
Oh, absolutely. When you look at patients and how they perceive healthcare inequity, they can perceive it in a number of different ways. But one of the interesting ways in which patients perceive healthcare inequity is looking at the diversity of the team that's providing their care. And if they don't see diversity in their team providing their care, that's a perceived inequity. And when you sort of extrapolate that to AI and imaging informatics, it becomes tremendously important to have that diversity of voices when we're initially doing that design thinking process and creating these new algorithms and tools that will then ultimately impact patient care down the line. So I've worked in a number of different settings where the initial design thinking process of these tools that will ultimately impact patient care really didn't have that diversity at the table. And you really need to work to build in that perspective so that you're creating a tool ultimately that won't deepen healthcare inequity, that will lessen healthcare inequity when it's applied to a large and diverse population. And I think for me as a woman, often when I'm the only woman at the table, handling my voice and handling my opinion can be interesting because I take my position and my privilege to be at that table, not just as my own voice then, but really as representing all the voices that aren't represented or haven't been represented. So a lot of times then as a leader, my personal opinions may take a little bit of a backseat as I work to represent the diversity of voices that aren't at the table. And then slowly, I can certainly work in my own opinions and my own thoughts and ideas. But as we're sort of working toward building the diversity at the table when we're designing new innovative patient care ideas, I think it's really important that as a woman or as an underrepresented minority, you work to represent all the voices that aren't at the table.
I think that's a great point. And we actually have a question later in the slide deck, so I don't want to quite spoil it yet, regarding if you were, ever the only woman at a table and how that made you feel. And if whether you felt that you couldn't express yourself as fully, or if you felt that you had to express yourself in a certain way. So we can expand on that discussion in a bit. And I did want to tell our audience right now too, that we are willing to take questions as the presentation goes to keep things dynamic. So if you do have questions, don't feel like you have to send them in at the end. I will be checking them throughout as well. Let me just see if there's any right now. I'll go back one. Here we go. All right. Looks like no questions quite yet, so we can go ahead and move on to this one. I think this is an interesting point. I often hear from women in the community that sometimes they feel like they can get their foot in the door, but when it comes to really getting to that next level leadership position is where they sometimes feel they encounter the most roadblocks. And I think this goes back to some of what was said earlier about needing to see someone else in your shoes who's made it to those leadership positions. So Dr. McGinty, we can start with you here. As someone is really interested in getting to that next step in their career, how do you think they can break through some of those roadblocks?
So I know we're going to talk about mentorship, but this is where I think sponsorship is critically important, and having, somebody who's keeping an eye out for you as you come to the table. Michelle Obama in her book says, too often we get to the table, but we're too scared to actually, say or do anything when we get there. So it is when we're going to bring non-traditional leaders into the room. And I say that sort of, obviously we know that the phenotype of leadership has looked a certain way. If we're going to bring in people who have a different lived experience, and certainly if they're the only person, it is incumbent on those of us already in the room to make sure that they are empowered, supported, prepared. I just had a conversation with someone who was taking on a major board role, just to talk about, how do you make sure that you get the information you need? How do you handle it if there's a question you want to ask, but you're feeling intimidated? That kind of preparation and support through the process is critically important if that person's going to be able to perform at the level that they can, and if they're going to really bring their unique voice to the discussion.
I agree. And Dr. Hawk, any suggestions here as well on how someone can kind of break through that final layer?
I think as women leaders, we're taught to be really strong and really tough and really resilient, and to sort of never show weakness and never show fault when we get to that boardroom table. But I think a dose of humility is also really important. And we really need to have a very good understanding of where our strengths and where our weaknesses are, and then have that courage to ask for help. We talk about, the importance of supporting people in their roles and giving them the resources and the mentorship and sponsorship that they need. But that person also really needs to be willing to ask for help and then to accept it in return. And it's hard to make that transition from being this strong, tough, sort of undefeatable leader to humility and saying, hey, I need some help and I don't know how to do this, or I do need some advice. So learning to find that balance, I think, can be tough for a new leader who's a little bit scared to sit at the table, but working through those challenges and really understanding that, and then understanding how your needs evolve as a young leader will serve someone very well in their new roles.
Sure.
Catherine, I would just add that, we have to face the unpleasant reality that for women and people of color, the latitude for failure is significantly narrower. So unfortunately, the stakes are high. So again, I think Elizabeth's exactly right. Making sure that you have people in your corner, but then, it's getting feedback is the worst, right? I'm not sure which is worse, giving or getting feedback, but, really being intentional about that.
And I think that humility aspect is important, especially when you are in a manager role of any kind. You want to portray you want to portray to your team that you are strong, of course, but I think it also makes someone more relatable when you admit sometimes some of your failures and how you overcame them. We did get a question from the audience regarding sometimes how to find out about opportunities. This reminds me a lot of that webinar we did, Dr. McGinty, with AWR on boards and how to learn about, the opportunities to be on a board for a company. I think Twitter went crazy when we had that webinar regarding how do you even know that such opportunities exist? So, what would you kind of tell someone in terms of finding out about new opportunities on that level?
Yeah, and it's been one of those things, I think, that, this concept of, cozy leadership circles where I tell you what's available and we don't really publicize it. So, I think you look at an organization like the ACR, which has a call for nominations out there. You still have a couple of days to volunteer to be in one of their slots. I think also, though, as a leader, really being intentional about populating committees and populating boards. I'm on a public company board now, and I like the way that, we look at a skills matrix for who we want on the board. So it transcends personalities, it transcends who I'm friends with. It's, does this person bring the right set of skills? So having a very, I think, thoughtful and data-driven approach to filling these kinds of positions. And then I think we'll get beyond some of that nebulous concept of fit that often excludes people who look different than how the board or the committee has always looked.
I think that's a great suggestion. I'm just seeing if any other questions came through.
I can chime in on that one as well. I think that in order to really understand what's out there and to get involved and to build that path for yourself, you need to be a master of communication and a master of networking. And it's not just about showing up in person now. It's really about digital networking across all different forms of media, whether that's email, social media, direct messaging on social media, and any of those different platforms. You really need to build a very strong professional brand presence.
Right.
And realize that ultimately it's your brand presence and your development of brand equity that's going to get you those positions. You may not be looking for a particular board position, but how you present yourself across a different digital media platform may ultimately win you that opportunity months or years down the line. So developing that strong professional brand and then being really a master of being present and having these real conversations, I think is what ultimately sort of opens those doors and allows you to see those opportunities ahead.
And I think that's an interesting point and a difficult one. I've done a few presentations with Dr. Alexander Tobin from Cincinnati Children's over the years on social media and radiology. And, I would imagine though, that as a busy physician, it's tough then to also make the time to establish your brand, think about what your presence is on the web. But I think you just made it clear that it is very important and fundamental in today's world. If you want to be considered for certain opportunities, you may have to put in that extra effort in those arenas. Yeah. Oh, Dr. McGinty, I think you're muted.
Yeah, we were having a little fire engine action here in New York City.
Fun.
So, not everyone has to be on Twitter. Right. But what you need to do is Google yourself and make sure that even your institution webpage highlights the things that you want to be involved in a leadership at a leadership level, or your LinkedIn page. Not having a presence on the web, or everyone has a presence on the web, but not being thoughtful about what yours is, I think is not going to be a successful strategy for getting into leadership these days.
Right. I think that certainly makes sense. So this brings us to question 4, which was a point that we brought up earlier, which was, have you ever been the only woman in the room during a meeting, and how did that affect the way that you acted? So Dr. Hawk, I don't know if you want to expand here a little bit more on how it affected you and that you felt that you sounds like you had to make the extra effort to make sure that you were representing various opinions and thoughts well, even above your own.
Yes. I've only been the only woman in a room around the table more times than I care to admit. In fact, the last time it happened, I was at RSNA at a large AI dinner meeting one night, and I looked around the 11 seats at the table, and I was the only woman sitting there. And I was surprised. It was very, very apparent to me right away. And I turned to my colleague, who's a wonderful friend of mine and a definite he for she advocate. And I said, did you notice? And he looks at me like I'm crazy. And I said, I'm the only woman here. And he goes, honestly, I didn't even notice. And then he felt really bad that he didn't even notice. And it kind of became a conversation. And I had a talk with one of my female colleagues and friends later about that experience and about how I chose to carry myself or my actions. And she was careful to point out, well, if you can't be authentic and be yourself, then it just sort of perpetuates where we're at right now. And you need to be comfortable being yourself, being your personality, being who you are as a female physician at that table, or it doesn't sort of make room or pave a way for other ones of us to sort of come out after you.
Right.
And, that kind of dovetails to another interesting experience I had. I got an interesting direct message from a trainee a few months ago. I did not know her well. We had not really interacted. And it just said, hey, I noticed you've been really comfortable about talking about some of the past challenges in your personal life. And I don't have anyone else to talk to in the professional world. And everything I'm going through is difficult and considered unprofessional as a woman leader. And can we just talk? And I think that's the kind of person and that's the kind of leader I want to be, is to create a comfortable space by being myself authentically around that table so that other women and other underrepresented minorities also feel that space to be comfortable and authentic around that table. And it's difficult and it requires some bravery because, as Geraldine said, there's almost no latitude for failure.
Right.
But there also is absolutely no latitude for stagnancy and for lack of forward progress to be authentic and to be leaders and to be who we are and all of our strengths and weaknesses. So having that bravery, pushing forward, being authentic, and showing other women and underrepresented minorities that you can be yourself around that table, I think is the most important thing for us to do right now.
I think that's a great perspective. And this question also brings up quite a bit. And Dr. McGinty, you've talked about this imposter syndrome, which I think is something that many women face, where you can be a leader in your field and sometimes still feel like, should I be here? Do I know what I'm talking about? And not to say that I'm sure there aren't men and other individuals that feel that from time to time, but it does seem to be more of a woman-centric problem, really, to kind of have some of those sentiments and feelings. Dr. McGinty, I know you've been the only woman at the table before, because that was one of the reasons why RADequal was first founded. So maybe you could share a little bit more about that story with everyone.
Yeah, sure. So one of your predecessors at Ambra, Minnie Paris, and I were at one of those dinners, Elizabeth, where we were the only women in the room, and we looked at each other and said, "Why are we always the only women in the room?" And that was where RADXX, now RADequals, was born. But I'm surprised we're using the past tense, because yes, all the time still. And I think for me, what coping strategy, which fortunately aligned with my interest, was sort of leaning into really detailed subject matter expertise on topics related to finance and healthcare payment policy, so that there was, as Janet Yellen says, I never wing it. So always being hyper prepared. I mean, I honestly have seen plenty of people show up to board meetings who clearly have not read the materials in advance. I never not read the materials in advance. So I think that's been a strategy that's helped me feel more confident about participating.
I think that makes sense. Dr. Hawk, we got an interesting comment from the audience who said that perhaps when he didn't notice you were the only woman there is really a compliment, that he sees everyone as equals. And I think that might kind of bring up another discussion point. I don't know if you want to chime in there, that, there's kind of sometimes that argument that comes up where it is great that he sees everyone as equals, but sometimes it's still important to notice when there's situations like that where things aren't well balanced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. But I think we also have a role for unconscious bias training and microaggression awareness and things like that. Because even if someone isn't aware and sort of doesn't see the difference or the discrepancy, it doesn't mean that it's not coloring their language or their thoughts. And someone can be a lovely person and really just have these deeply rooted unconscious bias because it's the way their field has always been. So I think it's a balanced approach that, yes, it's great if someone doesn't see the difference, if they're gender blind or colorblind or whatever you want to say. But I think that the most important thing is to see the difference and then see me or someone else as an equal at the same time. Right. And then really have a lot of awareness about how that affects actions and interactions. And to be aware that as someone then that is empowered to see the difference, make sure that they're a part of the cultural shift moving forward.
I think that's a really great way of putting it, to see the difference, but then treat as equals, to just be aware of what is going on in the room at any time. Let's see if there were any more questions on that section, and that audience member agreed that those were all good points as well. I think that can go ahead and bring us to mentoring and advocacy. We wanted to touch on this topic because this is, for us, a very core topic on what RADequal focuses on. And I think, first of all, there's so many great groups for women in radiology. But really kind of what our focus has been, as I said, is the Speakers Bureau and these opportunities for women to get into leadership roles and see other women in those roles, which is why we wanted to touch on this section. And then we will end on work-life balance in a little bit as well. So Dr. McGinty, we can start with you here. This is always, I feel like, the million-dollar question. How do you define the difference between a mentor and a sponsor, and why might it be important for someone to have both in their career?
Great, thank you. Definitely something I'm passionate about. I think of a mentor as someone, as like a coach, someone who's interested in your career progression and success, and who gives you a sense of what you should do. A sponsor is somebody who really offers you opportunities, who's talking about you when you're not in the room, who is really opening the door for you. And I think there is data out there that women tend to be over-mentored. There's a lot of "you should do this." And what I think is critically important is, here's an opportunity. Not only do I think you can do it, but I think you'll succeed. And to your early point about imposter syndrome, knowing that there's somebody who believes that you can do this, I think is really, really powerful. So absolutely, it's important to have both. And actually, and I would say a diverse group of them. I'm not crazy about the sort of very, focused one-on-one and only having one mentor, because if that goes wrong, it can go very wrong. Sure. Diversifying your portfolio, I think, is important in many aspects of life, including this one.
I think that certainly makes a lot of sense. And I agree. You don't need to necessarily pick the one and only mentor or sponsor of your life. I think they can come in a variety of forms and from a variety of situations. I don't even think it has to be someone necessarily in your field directly. Might be someone in your personal life, a friend, whoever. We all have different relationships in our lives where that person can make a strong impact on us. What about you, Dr. Hogg? How would you define the difference between a mentor and a sponsor?
I would say, first, get rid of age structure. Your mentor or sponsor does not have to be older than you.
Right.
I've had phenomenal mentors and sponsors that are younger than me and older than me. And thank you, Geraldine, for your mentorship and sponsorship over the years.
Right back at you.
Fantastic. And the other thing I would say is it doesn't have to be in radiology. You can have fantastic mentors and sponsors outside of radiology. And the other thing I would say is you can be mentored and a mentee at the same time. And you can be a sponsor and a sponsee at the same time. And it's not one of those things where you sort of are an early career and then magically you make that transition from a mentee to a mentor. You should be sort of giving and receiving throughout all phases of your career. So we sort of need to let go of the age structure and let go of the career structure and realize that we can open ourselves up to a range of rich interactions and possibilities by just being really open to diversity of opinions and advice and opportunity from all different people surrounding us.
I'll just add, Catherine, when we were thinking about, transitioning the name of this initiative, I referenced Dr. Evelyn Carroll, and, she was more than willing to spend time with me. And she's a resident at Mayo, more than willing to spend time with me so that I could understand, how this concept perhaps was perceived in our broader community of women. So, exactly your point, Elizabeth, this concept of reverse mentoring, I think, is so important. Having the perspective of people who are earlier in their careers, just as important as getting the perspective of senior leaders.
I think that's a really great point, getting rid of what we may perceive as traditional roles for mentors and sponsors. With that, Dr. McGinty, what would you say is your top tip for a successful sponsor or mentor relationship?
Ooh, I'm not sure I can narrow it down to one. I mean, a lot of programs, a lot of organizations now have structured mentorship programs, and I definitely think there's a role for those. And some people like to really set a mentorship contract. What do I expect? What do you expect? I haven't really done that, but I am clear, especially with sponsorship relationships. I'm very clear what I expect. If I introduce you to someone, I want, they need to thank you. Ideally, I need to hear from you when you've spoken to them. I need you to keep in touch, tell me how it's going. So some of that etiquette around making sure that those opportunities are leveraged appropriately is something that I take very seriously. Everyone's going to slip up. Everyone's going to forget. I'm certain I'd like to think I'm pretty generous about that. But remember, when you go out for a sponsorship opportunity that I've opened up for you, you're wearing my jersey. And if you don't show up and if you don't perform, the next time I ask that person to give someone an opportunity for me, they may not be as willing to do that. So there is a responsibility that you as the sponsee have to really do your best.
I think just approaching everything with a very grateful and a very empathetic heart is so important. There's this softness to the art of medicine that sometimes gets lost in the business world as we transition to these high-powered positions. And I think just taking a moment to be grateful for the connection and to have this sense of responsibility, not only for like performance, but for who you are as a person when you're showing up to the table is tremendously important. And it goes both ways. So, if Geraldine sponsors me for something, yes, I'm wearing her jersey. But then, she's also wearing mine. And it's this two-way connection that we can build. And there's a lot of brand equity to be gained in the power of that connection. But I think it has to be gained with sort of this softness and this empathetic and this grateful heart as you sort of build human connections, which sometimes gets lost in the high-powered business world. And
I'm laughing, Elizabeth, because I sound terrifying and you sound so much nicer. I think everyone's going to want you to sponsor them.
I think that is an important conversation. It reminds me of a lot on those, the webinar series that we did together, Dr. McGinty with AWR. You know, we really focused a lot on some of these, I almost want to call them etiquette topics or basic business how-tos that, you know, for some reason, obviously are not something most people learn during their undergraduate time, or even I think in graduate programs. And there almost seems to be this whole separate area of basic business sense and etiquette practices, email strategy, whatever you want to call it, that is a really big learning process for a lot of folks when they start their career.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Mentorship. You need mentorship on how to be mentored. It's
right.
It's a whole thing that you don't learn, and it can be intimidating and difficult to navigate, particularly if, like for me, I've had toxic mentoring relationships or bad sponsoring relationships where I was being given or put into opportunities that really were not in my best interest. And so recognizing what's a good mentorship and what's a good sponsorship is also really important. And there's etiquette around breaking up with your mentor or breaking up with your sponsor or saying no. And these are all really difficult things to navigate. But the most important thing is that you don't navigate them alone.
Right, that you have someone giving you that advice along the way. Certainly, I think this is something else I've heard quite a bit from the community is saying no can be particularly hard for a lot of women and something that they struggle with. They want to be willing to participate and commit to absolutely everything. And then oftentimes they suffer from severe burnout for that reason.
Or just can't possibly deliver. And again, going back to, you know, and believe me, please don't ask me about how to say no because I'm really terrible at it. But what I've tried to do more recently is really think about, does this opportunity match the things that I've said are really important to me? Because, you know, you can't bring your ego to this. If somebody asks you to give a talk, there are probably plenty of other people that could give that talk. So, you know, just make sure that if you say no, that you then suggest another potential speaker, which is why, of course, we did the Speakers Bureau, because, you know, we want to make it easy for people to choose a more diverse panel of speakers.
Right. And we just got an audience question that said, how do you say no to basically a mentor or sponsor relationship when you already have a full plate of mentor and sponsor relationships without discouraging someone? So I guess the question is here, let's say someone approaches you for advice, wanting you to mentor them, but you already have a full plate at the moment. You really can't, you know, how do you politely say no to them without discouraging them in their career or making them perhaps afraid to seek another mentor or sponsor?
I always have time for one conversation. I always do. I mean, because for me, it's so professionally satisfying to connect with people who are looking to advance their careers. So I always have time for that. And honestly, I find that a lot of times I can think of somebody who's going to be a really good connection for that person. So I can sort of introduce them on, you know, so that's where I am on
it. If someone is reaching out to someone to ask for mentorship or sponsorship advice, there's usually some kind of trigger or straw that broke the camel's back or some kind of event that kind of pushed them over the edge to then ask for help. And I think we have this huge responsibility to at least have this initial conversation. All of us can find 1 hour over the course of a week. There's really no reason not to. And then I think after I sort of have that initial conversation and see, okay, what was the crisis mode, or what's the need, or what are we looking at? If I can't personally be the best mentor or sponsor for this people for whatever reason, maybe my interests aren't aligned, or maybe I am overcommitted, then I can at least set them up on the right path with the correct group of people, the correct network, the correct mentors and sponsors. That initial lift actually takes very little effort. It just takes time and listening. All of us have that initial time, and then you can set that person on the right trajectory with the right group of people going there. I do have some people that reach out to me that I do think that I can provide mentorship or sponsorship in their lives, and those people I will continue to interact with, but others I'll have that initial conversation and then help get them on the correct trajectory with the right group of people.
I think that's a great suggestion. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to the next section because we do have a hard stop with Dr. McGinty at 12:45 today, but we will be staying on for a few minutes afterwards for Dr. Hawk to answer any additional questions. So I wanted to jump to another section that I think comes up a lot, particularly for women, and that's work-life balance. And we can start here with you, Dr. McGinty. How do you recommend that someone balances a family life while they also have things like conferences and educational sessions? And one thing that's come up with individuals is, when we say family life, we're certainly not just talking about children here. People are responsible for elderly parents. People are responsible for friends who need help, spouses, neighbors, whoever. Generally, as someone gets older, you find that your circle of people that you are responsible for helping widens. And I think that that can become a really big struggle. Oftentimes, someone is just kind of getting to that great point, the apex of their career, and suddenly they have increased family responsibilities as well. And I think that that can be quite challenging.
Well, I'm certainly going to defer to Elizabeth, who does this with incredible grace and apparently seamlessly and effortlessly, but I know that's probably not the case. I think, though, we have some valuable lessons to pull out of the pandemic, and I'll actually pivot a little bit and talk about some of our colleagues who live with disabilities. And, we used to insist that you had to be there in person. And then we realized that, we could have these meetings and we could have valuable interactions. Clearly, we'd love to be in person all of the time. But again, if we want to have a diverse group of voices around the table, we need to make sure that we empower that and enable it. So whether it's, not having meetings only on Saturdays when we know that some of our community are just simply never going to be able to be there because of their religious beliefs, or that, not including our colleagues who bring the valuable perspective of living with a disability because we insist that they need to travel in person. So I think we can be flexible in how we engage and how we allow people to engage. But let me turn it over to Elizabeth because she's got a lot more to share on this than I do.
So I'm a single mom of 3 boys, ages 12, 10, and 7, and they are my world. May look graceful sometimes, but it's barely controlled chaos all of the time. And I think my best advice is to be unapologetic. It's not like, oh, how do you balance it all? Or, oh, isn't that tough? It's like, no, it's wonderful. And I love my life. And I really do involve my boys in what I do and explain what I do and why I'm doing it. They've sat in on ACR leadership meetings. They've listened to me giving lectures on diversity. A lot of times they'll sit on the couch while I'm teaching or reading out a resident in nuclear medicine. They don't interrupt. They don't detract from me being a doctor. I'm a better doctor, not a worse one for being a mom. But I think it's about understanding that there isn't work and then professional life. And it's this big balancing act on other sides of the scale. And you need to do this time Sudoku thing. It's about being who you are authentically, unapologetically, and knowing that the fact that I am a strong physician leader is coloring my young sons' minds and painting who they see women as and what their vision is for the future, and is an asset to their own development. I do have a lot of help. I have built a really strong tribe. I go at nothing alone, and a lot of credit goes to the amazing people around me. But I think the most important thing is just to be authentic and unapologetic in who you are, and know that what you are bringing to your family life, whatever that is an asset and not a detriment, and to stop feeling guilty about it, and to know that you're actually a gift to your children as a physician, and not something that you need to be ashamed of or afraid to balance.
I will add, though, we need paid family leave. We need better childcare. We need flexibility.
Yes.
That has to be programmed in.
Yes, completely agree.
And I think that, the point you brought up, Dr. Hawk, about having help in a community around you, I think we touched on this a bit earlier. Oftentimes women have trouble saying no or trouble asking for help and are very committed to doing it all themselves. And it is okay to step back and say, I really actually need some extra help with that, because no one can go at everything alone. And I loved your point, Dr. McGinty, about COVID. One of the, bright sides is bringing everyone together in a weird way. We saw more insights into our personal lives. My colleague and I both had babies that year. So we were working, taking care of our babies at home. We would have these kinds of calls and the babies would entertain each other on Zoom for that first year. So it was just really, certainly a stressful time, but also a time where I think people began to understand, wait a minute, there might be different ways that we could be doing things here that we didn't realize all along. So I think we already answered a bit of question 2. Maybe before Dr. McGinty, you have to head out right now. Dr. Hawk, if you want to take this question, just kind of some final words on, do you think in general, women are choosing facilities that provide a better work-life balance and that are supportive for parents?
I think a simple answer to that is yes, especially with the new generation of up-and-coming radiologists and healthcare providers. People are looking for work-life balance and supportive programs. It just highlights the need for paid family leave and everything from lactation facilities to supportive programs who really understand the importance of the person as a whole. And I think that every program needs to sort of step up and get to this new gold standard of education, of employment, of work-life balance. So yes, absolutely. I don't think anyone can dispute that.
I think that is certainly very true. It looks like we haven't received any more questions, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up for today. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. I know SIIM will be posting the recording and the slides for this webinar, and we will be emailing out it as well. So thank you again, both of you, for today's really fantastic discussion. I think our audience took away a lot from it. I know I certainly did. And hopefully we can have another one of these panels soon as well.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.